and I'd like to welcome to the stage Ilya Klauzner.
Hi, I'm Ilya Klauzner from the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, and I'd first like to do an acknowledgement of country. So we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I acknowledge their continuing connection to country, culture and community, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So let's get right into it. So it's probably not a surprise to anybody in this room, but Aboriginal people are overrepresented in custody. So they're overrepresented both in sentence custody, but also in remand custody. It's good feedback, anyway. So remand custody occurs when a person is denied bail and has to wait in custody until their court date. So Aboriginal people make up 27.8% of the remand population in New South Wales, even though they only account for 2.2% of the whole population. And that inequality has been rising. So since 2015, with the new Bail Act, the remand population for Aboriginal people has increased by 67% compared to 19% for non-Aboriginal people. So Steve Young and I did a study in 2021 that also examined bail decisions. So it examined court bail decisions and police bail decisions that occurred between 2015 and 2019. And in that study, we found that Aboriginal defendants were 20% more likely to be denied bail by police, even after accounting for factors such as prior offences, the severity of the current offence, and many demographic factors as well. So one kind of thought of that study would be that the 20%, one reason could be that police are biased against Aboriginal defendants, or one hypothesis could be that, and that could be contributing to this inequality in remand rates. However, unfortunately, that study wasn't able to detect bias. So one of the reasons was custody managers, so they're the police officers who make the bail decision. They consider a wide range of factors under the Bail Act, and most of those were unobservable to our study. So those included things like criminal associations, family connections, any reasons to be free. And we didn't see those things or observe those things in the study. And so perhaps police custody managers were making their bail decisions on the unobservable factors that we couldn't see. The second kind of issue is that under the Bail Act, custody managers have to reduce the risk of misconduct on bail. However, our study didn't examine whether police custody managers were doing that effectively or consistently, and so we can't make a kind of conclusion on whether police officers were biased. So this study kind of attempts to, I guess, show a new methodology and see if that can, in an attempt to detect bias, the existence or non-existence of bias towards Aboriginal people. So yeah, our presentation, pretty normal structure, but I just want to signpost that a lot of the presentation is going to be about the method, which is new, so that's going to take up quite a chunk. So I kind of first wanted to introduce bail in New South Wales. So I don't expect you guys to read that whole flow chart. I guess I just want to show that there are many bail decisions many police decisions that occur after a defendant has been, an offence has been detected for a defendant. And the bail decision is only one in a number of decisions, and that's the bail decision we examine in this study is the one in blue. So bail decisions in New South Wales are made by police custody managers. So once an offender is charged and arrested, they'll be brought to a police station, and a custody manager will assess their risks and either deny bail. If they're bail denied, they'll go in front of the police and in front of the courts, and the courts will make another bail decision. And if bail is granted, then that defendant will be at liberty until their court date. So this study just focuses on the police bail decision. So the first reason for that is that that's where we found the disparity in our previous study, but also that's the decision that determines whether a defendant will enter remand. And that decision the police custody manager has to make is to do an unacceptable risk test. So under the Bail Act, a police custody manager has to assess whether a defendant is at risk of a bail concern, if that risk is unacceptable, then they must deny bail. And the bail concerns are a failure to appear at court, committing a serious offence on bail, endangering the safety of victims, interfering with the witnesses or evidence. So in this paper, we essentially argue that if we want to assess bias, we've got to kind of look at what custody managers are trying to achieve, which is that they are trying to minimise the unacceptable risk and see if they are doing that in a consistent way for both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. So that's our main research question. So the research question is if Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal defendants with the same risk of receiving bail have the same risk of reoffending and absconding on bail. So those are the two main bail concerns that police custody managers are trying to minimise, and we're asking if they're minimising that consistently. So to say that in other words, the question is if police custody managers are consistently minimising the risk of offending and absconding on bail for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal defendants. So the challenge when answering that question is that there is a very substantial difference in the rate of bail being granted between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. So 46% of Aboriginal people have their bail granted by police compared to 65% of non-Aboriginal people. But there's also, on the other hand, a disparity in bail misconduct, where we see 29% of Aboriginal people who are released on bail reoffending and absconding compared to 16% of non-Aboriginal people. So how do we find a way to see if the disparity in bail being granted can be explained by the disparity in bail misconduct on bail? So on to my method. So I'm not going to do a technical description of this method. I'm just going to try to, with some stylized graphs, illustrate what the method is. So you can think of this kind of graph as what one police custody manager may see. So they may see like 7 hypothetical defendants, and what they have to do, what they must do under the Bail Act, is they must assess their risk of bail misconduct. And they have to determine if that's acceptable or unacceptable. So what that suggests is that each police custody manager is going to have their own threshold of what they believe is an unacceptable or acceptable risk. And so I've kind of illustrated that threshold using the yellow line in the chart, and then each hypothetical defendant, 1 through 7, has a risk of misconduct. So for number 5, it's 20%, and the threshold is also 20%. And so under that kind of framework, then any kind of defendant whose risk is assessed to be under 20% should have their bail granted, and any defendant whose risk is assessed to be over 20% should have their bail refused. And then we can kind of think about in that framework what an example of biased decision making will be. So, for example, on the left, you'd see kind of a lenient threshold that a police custody manager may apply. And so if we're thinking about bias, if the defendants were non-Aboriginal, a police custody manager may apply the threshold on the left, and if they were Aboriginal, they might apply the threshold on the right. So the threshold on the right, 10%, is harsher, only defendant 1 is released on bail, compared to on the left where defendants 1 through 4 are released on bail. And so what's also important to note is what we observe. So as a researcher, you observe the behaviour of people who are released on bail. So if we're like looking at only the people granted, if a police custody manager is biased, only the defendants with the lowest risk will be released on bail, and those are the people we'll observe. So we're likely to observe a lower rate of bail misconduct if there's biased behaviour. And then the other thing that we can think about is that if there's a defendant, so in this chart, defendants 5 and defendant 2, who are kind of on the margins of release, so they have a risk of misconduct that is similar to the threshold that a custody manager has. those defendants will sometimes be released on bail and sometimes be denied. But for the defendants that are released on bail, we can observe their misconduct rates, and those misconduct rates will allow us to see what the police custody manager's threshold was and be able to assess if that threshold differed for two different groups, like non-Aboriginal defendants and Aboriginal defendants. And just to illustrate, unbiased decision-making in our definition is that custody managers are applying the same threshold in risk of bail misconduct to two different groups, here Aboriginal defendants and non-Aboriginal defendants. So yes, our test looks at these outcomes. So just to reiterate, if Aboriginal defendants have a lower rate of bail misconduct than non-Aboriginal defendants, we are able to conclude that custody managers are likely biased against Aboriginal defendants, and if vice versa, Aboriginal defendants have a higher rate of bail misconduct than non-Aboriginal defendants, custody managers are likely biased against non-Aboriginal defendants. So how do we find those marginal defendants? Well, I don't know if anybody was at Steve Marchard's presentation yesterday, but we actually use a very similar method and he explained it a lot better, so yeah. So basically we're using this variation in that some custody managers will be lenient and some will be harsh, and we can calculate that by how many bail granted they've had or how many times they've refused bail. But at a certain time, in a certain place, the allocation of a custody manager to a defendant is random. That means a defendant can't decide which police officer will make their bail decision. And so that gives us some randomness to determine, to see what the behaviour would be of defendants that have only been released on bail because they got a lenient custody manager and they would have been detained if they got a harsh custody manager. So that's an instrumental variable strategy for people who know what that is. And what we examine is the impact of release on bail misconduct for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. So that number in itself isn't very interesting. So people who are released on bail will engage in more misconduct than people who are refused on bail just because they have the opportunity to reoffend or abscond on bail. But the difference allows us to kind of ascertain the different risks of the people who were released on bail and to kind of do that test in outcomes. And so kind of on the last point, it's if the impact of release on misconduct is lower for Aboriginal defendants than non-Aboriginal defendants, then it means custody managers are applying a harsher standard and they're only releasing defendants who are lower in risk, and that means that custody managers are likely biased against Aboriginal defendants. So what sample did we examine? Well, we looked at all bail decisions, which formally is a bail court attendance notice that were issued between 2015 and 2021. We excluded other court attendance notices called field and future court attendance notices. So for those people, they don't have a formal bail decision, they're just get their court attendance notice in the mail and a bail decision isn't made. We exclude young people because they have slightly different conditions under the Bail Act. We exclude any custody managers that have made less than 15 bail decisions in a year because that doesn't allow us to kind of ascertain their leniency or harshness very well. And we don't examine defendants that are already in custody and only take one bail decision per person per day. So that leaves us with just shy of 130,000 non-Aboriginal defendants, just shy of 50,000 Aboriginal defendants, and more than 2,200 custody managers who are making those bail decisions. So I've harped on about bail misconduct, but what are we actually examining when we look at bail misconduct? Well, unfortunately, we can only examine the first two kind of points under the Act, which is reoffending on bail or absconding before on bail. The other two we don't really have data on. So any misconduct is any reoffence on bail or any absconding charge on bail. We also look at those two separately. We look at violent offending and serious reoffending, which is kind of a hybrid measure of the Premier's priority target, but removes certain low-level offences like dealing drugs and trafficking drugs in non-commercial quantities. And then kind of to think about potential bias in detection on which offences are detected. We've also kind of made a measure of reoffending, which are more of offences which are more likely to be detected by the police, including homicide, robbery, break and enter, and theft of a motor vehicle. So our characteristics of the sample. So this is the sample that was refused bail. So we find that 25% of Aboriginal defendants were between 18 and 24 compared to 18% of non-Aboriginal defendants. 16% of Aboriginal defendants were female compared to 11% of non-Aboriginal defendants. Aboriginal defendants were a lot less likely to live in a major city. They were more likely to have a property offence as their index offence. Aboriginal defendants had more prior court appearances on average, and their Aboriginal defendants were also more likely to have a prior prison penalty compared to non-Aboriginal defendants. So on to our results. So on our measure of any misconduct, we kind of see, so this graph kind of shows us for our measure of any misconduct, the impact of release on misconduct for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. So the first line is non-Aboriginal people, and it shows that non-Aboriginal people who are released on bail, who are on the margins of release, are 19.8 percentage points more likely to reoffend or abscond on bail compared to non-Aboriginal people. So that impact, again, isn't surprising because they have more opportunity to do it than people who are refused bail. But we find that the impact of bail release on misconduct is very similar for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal defendants on the margins of release, which means the defendants on the margins of release have similar risk of bail misconduct. And we find that for every outcome we examine, there's slight differences when we get into more specific offending, but those differences are not consistent with bias against Aboriginal defendants, and they're also not statistically significant. So what have we done in this study? Well, we've looked across a range of misconduct outcomes and found that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal defendants had similar rates of bail misconduct for those people who are at the margins of release. That suggests that custody managers are applying a similar threshold when they determine whether they refuse or grant bail. So we don't find in this study evidence of bias by custody managers once we account for bail misconduct. It's important to note we only examined bail, formal court bail, the formal police bail decision, but there are many decisions that occurred before that point, including the decision to whether to arrest or charge a defendant and the policing practices before that. And if any bias occurred in those stages, we wouldn't be able to pick that up in our study. Our definition of bias is narrow. It is only tests for bias perpetrated by individual custody managers at a point in time. But of course, as Professor Horvain illustrated in her keynote, there are many different definitions of bias, and any structural discrimination that occurred and any historic discrimination that occurred wouldn't be picked up in this study. So what are the implications? Well, it does suggest, this study, that any investment in strategies or supports or programs to support Aboriginal people on bail would reduce the disparity in bail refusal rates. But of course, further research should also be taken into other points in the police decision-making process to see if police do demonstrate bias in other areas and if those biases could compound into the bail decision and entry into custody. And of course, structural bias in the criminal justice system should also be examined. So we didn't look at whether organisations like the police or the justice system as an organisation are fairly treating Aboriginal people. For example, there's no comment about whether the Bail Act is fair, but just that it is being consistently applied by police custody managers between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. But of course, research into the fairness of legislation is also very important. Thanks.
Questions?
Hi, my name's Sabella. Thanks for the great presentation. You said at the start of the presentation that you isolated to that decision point because that was where you detected bias or potential bias from a previous study. Did you use the same method, leniency design, at the judge decision point as well?
No, we haven't done that study yet for bail, and it's potentially could be an interesting next step. We also did the previous study in 2021 for magistrates as well as for custody managers, and we didn't find that for magistrates, once you accounted for like prior offending and other demographic characteristics, we didn't find any differences between the likelihood of bail being refused towards Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal people. But this method would be more rigorous in examining that, so it's always a possibility as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, if there are no more questions, join me in thanking Ilya.